we turn our attention over a period of time of trading to a setting where we have an underlying portfolio, a distribution of wealth across stocks, and we are going to keep that portfolio intact. In other words, at all moments of time, we want the distribution of wealth in the stocks to be governed in these proportions, A1, A2 through A sub M. This is sometimes called a constantly rebalanced portfolio, because when you initially start with your wealth and you spread it out across the stocks, at the end of a day's trading, the stocks are worth different amounts, and so we have different amounts invested in different stocks. What we then do promptly at the end of the next day's trading is to move resources around so that, again, all the stocks have got resources allocated in the proportions A1 through AM. Run it through another day, and we do the same thing again, rebalance the portfolio so that at the end of each day, the distribution of stocks, the allocation of stocks, stays in the same proportion as given by the portfolio choice A. Okay, so this is the setting of a constantly rebalanced portfolio. We're imagining, of course, this is not practical, but we are imagining we're doing this daily. Okay. Now, with this in mind, how does wealth grow? The growth of wealth is governed by a succession of days governed by stock price relatives, where a vector of stock price relatives gives us ratios for individual stocks of closing price on a given day to the closing price on the previous day. For a given stock price relative vector, boldface X, the wealth ratio, the amount over that day that wealth is increased, is given by S of X, a weighted sum A1x1 plus A2x2 through AMXM. Now let's see what happens when we have a succession of days of investment. So we're going to look at a day by number. For each day, we're going to look at the vector of stock price relatives X for that day. We're going to look at how much wealth grows the daily wealth relative, that is, the wealth at the end of the day to the wealth at the end of the previous day, S of X. And then we're actually going to look at how the wealth is growing overall over the succession of days. So let's start by setting the stage at, say, day number 0, numbered arbitrarily. And let's say we start with an initial wealth of $1. W sub 0, the wealth at the start of day 1, W0, is 1. Now what happens on day 1? At the end of the first day's trading, each stock moves up or down and is governed by a stock relative for that stock. The vector of stock relatives for day 1 is a vector X, but now the notation is going to get a little more cumbrous, but not too grievous, I hope. Right. We are going to have to track which vector of stock relatives for which day. Let's use a superscript 1 to remind ourselves that this is a vector of stock price relatives for day 1. This is a vector of stock price ratios at the end of day 1 to the end of day 0. For that vector of stock price relatives, the wealth relative at the end of day 1 is S of x1. And what is the S of x1? It is a weighted sum of A's times X's. But the X's now are for that particular vector of stock price relatives for day 1. Let's give it a short name, right? The equation is getting to be a mouthful. Let's just call it S1. So S1 is the daily wealth relative at the end of day 1. It is the proportion wealth has increased over the course of the first day. And so now what is your net wealth? Well, your net wealth will be, let's call it W with a subscript 1 to tell ourselves we're dealing with the end of day 1. W1 says start with the initial wealth, W0, and multiply it by your daily wealth relative for day 1, S1. Of course, W0 is 1, so W1 is just S1 in this case. But let's build on it one more day. Now we have a new wealth. 1 has become something else. It's now W1. That is going to get reinvested in the stock market. And what we're going to do is rebalance the portfolio. Because individual stocks have gone up and down, the percentages in each stock are now not in the ratio of the original portfolio. Rebalance it by moving stocks around, moving prices around, moving allocations around, until we have, at the end of day 1, all stocks are now in the proportions A1 through AM. We've rebalanced our portfolio. And now we start day 2. Now let's see what happens. Day 2 is governed by another set of chance occurrences. It gives rise to a vector of stock relatives, call it X, with a superscript 2 now to tell ourselves we're dealing with stock price relatives for day 2. The wealth relative over the course of the day, how much proportionately has wealth increased or decreased over that day, is of course S of X2. It's a weighted sum of the stock price relatives for day 2. Give it a short and compact name, call it S2. This is the proportion that wealth has increased over day 2. How much in total? Well, I remember at the end of day 1 I have W1. And so your net wealth at the end of day 2 is W1 times S2, the wealth relative for day 2. Of course, now we can imagine how we're going to do this. Day 3 begins with an initial wealth distributed according to my portfolio, A1 through AM. The initial wealth now for day 3 is W2. Day 3 is going to see a stock relative, X3. That gives rise to a wealth relative, S of X3, which I'll call S3. And S3 will multiply my initial wealth W2 to give my new wealth. And of course, we're going to build on this day by day by day. And eventually, let's say we look at day number N. In day N, the vector of stock relatives for the M individual stocks is now some other chance-driven entity, X with a superscript N, catching the day. The wealth relative over the course of that day, the proportion wealth has increased over the course of day N, Sn, is S of Xn. And what is the net wealth? Well, at the end of day N, you have Wn, and Wn looks at what is the starting point, Wn minus 1, at the end of the previous day, multiplies it by the wealth relative Sn, and there you have it. Wn then is Wn minus 1 times Sn. Now, this gives us a very clean and simple way of expressing how wealth is growing. But of course, we would like to come to some deterministic conclusions about what is happening. This is what we will turn to next.